Finance Minister Lawrence Wong says the Singapore government must acknowledge and address the legitimate concerns of each and every segment of the population, which is in line with the country's definition of a fair and just society. But the challenge lies in not allowing the country's politics to be based on identity that is exclusionary and driven by self-interest. Mr. Wong was speaking at a conference on what the rise of a new form of tribalism or identity politics means for Singapore. Deborah Wong with more.
Us versus them. Friend versus foe. The emphasis on the self at the expense of the community lies at the heart of tribalism. It's a slippery slope that Mr. Lawrence Wong says can deepen fault lines.
Once this sort of tribal identity takes root, it becomes difficult to achieve any compromise. Because when we anchor our politics on identity, any compromise seems like dishonor. Every grievance threatens one's self-worth, and every setback a challenge to one's sense of self. So we get a downward spiral. Individualism and self-interest cause tribes to form. Each tribe closes ranks upon itself, and politics becomes defined as all-out war among tribes.
Singapore learnt the hard way through racial riots in the past. Mr. Wong says that's shaped the way the government handles different viewpoints. For starters, he says it must recognise that different groups have their own valid anxieties.
This is what a fair and just society must mean, and we cannot, in the name of avoiding the dangers of identity politics, deny the rights of a variety of groups to organise themselves so as to gain recognition for their concerns or seek to improve their conditions and well-being.
One of the ways he suggests to tackle tribalism and identity politics is to draw on what he calls a trader instinct, referencing the country's forefathers in trade. Groups must work towards a win-win situation and engage one another. Stressing that the government is committed to being an honest broker, he also cautions against stereotyping groups of people to a single dimension, as this runs the risk of hardened views. He adds that the reality is that identities are multifaceted. Beyond the causes each group champion, Mr. Wong says they must remember they are first and foremost Singaporean.
If we uphold this idea that being Singaporean is a matter of conviction and choice, and that it takes priority over our other identities and affiliations, that would give all of us one important commonality around which to build understanding and trust, to negotiate our differences and find common ground on difficult issues, and then we can continually look for ways to move forward together.
During a dialogue session where Mr. Wong fielded questions from foreign participants, he said government policies must evolve to meet the changing needs of different generations and groups. Here's more from Deborah Wong.
The question of whether identity is a generational issue set the stage during the session. Now, the spotlight was on an increasingly vocal Singaporean youth who believe political and social issues are as important as bread and butter matters. Mr. Wong says it's to be expected that new dimensions of inequality will emerge as society evolves. Now, this brings on stronger calls for fairness, which Mr. Wong says is at the core of its policies. Public housing, for instance, used to just be for married couples. Today, that's expanded to singles. Mr. Wong stresses that the government will attempt to understand how attitudes and mindsets are shifting. For instance, he says it should continue to engage groups and understand the legitimate concerns of those marginalized, such as the migrant worker and LGBTQ communities.
We talk to different groups all the time, LGBTQ, religious groups, young and old, and you can perceptibly, it's very clear, sentiments and attitudes are shifting, especially amongst young people, but also shifting for the whole of society. So in that sense, the conversations do play a part. It's not futile. It's not as though things will be static forever. You know, as these attitudes and sentiments shift, then, you know, society will have to think about where the balance might be, and the government too will have to consider what that balance would be appropriate for society and what policies might have to adjust.
However, some advocates that attended panel discussion later in the forum were skeptical that minority groups will see progress. Writer Ng Ee Sheng says the LGBTQ community, for instance, still experience pushback from conservative religious groups. AWARE's Executive Director Corina Lim says the notion of a Singaporean identity can be destabilizing as it emphasizes the divide between locals and foreigners, including PRs and immigrants. Now, there was a call to focus instead on unifying values of diversity. Academics who were also present say groups must remember that they are bigger than a singular identity, and they must instead find commonalities as individuals. This is how constructive engagement starts.